Captain Lee's eyes fluttered open to a world of strange colors and shapes. His head hurt. The last clear memory was piloting his experimental spacecraft when a bright light engulfed everything. Now he lay on something soft and unfamiliar. The room around him was enormous. Ceiling so high he could barely make it out. Strange plants with purple leaves grew along the walls. Everything seemed built for someone much larger than a human. "The tiny one is moving," a deep voice said from somewhere above. Lee tried to sit up, his muscles aching in protest. What he saw made him freeze. 3 giant figures stood around what appeared to be his bed. They looked like women, but impossibly tall, at least 3 times his height. Their skin shimmered with a light purple tone. Large, completely black eyes studied him with open curiosity. "I must be dreaming," Lee whispered. One of the giants stepped closer. She wore flowing robes with intricate patterns. "You are not dreaming, small creature. I am High Counselor Ja. You have come to Magna." Lee swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I'm Captain Lee from Earth. How did I get here?" "Your vessel fell from the sky," another giant said. This one had complex markings across her face and arms. "I am Chief Scientist Neri. We found you unconscious inside. Your technology is unlike anything we have seen." The third giant kept her distance. She wore what looked like armor made of shining metal plates. "Security Commander Hannah." She introduced herself with obvious suspicion. "You will remain under watch until we know you are not dangerous." Lee almost laughed at that. How could someone his size threaten these enormous beings? He barely reached their waists. "My ship, is it badly damaged?" he asked. "Parts are destroyed," Neri said. "We are studying what remains." Over the next several days, Lee learned about his new situation. The Magnans, as they called themselves, had brought him to their central city. Their buildings were built to their scale, doorways 30 feet tall, furniture that Lee needed a ladder to climb onto. They crafted a special room for him with human-sized items. The Magnans looked after Lee with care, though their attempts at providing food and clothing were often comically oversized at first. They seemed fascinated by everything about him, especially his small size. During a walk through their botanical gardens, massive spaces filled with towering alien plants, High Counselor Gia explained their problem. "Our people are dying out," she said, her voice solemn. "For many generations, fewer and fewer children are born. Those who are born often do not survive to adulthood." Lee looked up at her, shielding his eyes from the bright light of their twin suns. "I'm sorry to hear that. Our scientists believe it is a problem in our genetic code," Gia continued. "Something is breaking down. We have tried many solutions, but nothing works." "Why tell me this?" Lee asked, confused. "I'm not a doctor or scientist." Nari, who had joined them, knelt down to be closer to Lee's level. Even kneeling, she towered over him. "Your arrival might be what saves us. We have never met another intelligent species before. Your body works differently from ours. Your genes might hold the answer." "My genes," Lee repeated. "But I'm just a pilot. I don't know anything about genetics." "Yet you come from a thriving world," Neri said. "Your species survived whatever challenges ours did not. Something in your makeup might help us understand what went wrong with ours." Lee felt the weight of their hopeful gazes. These giant women were looking at him, a lost human who had arrived by accident, as some kind of savior. The thought made him dizzy. "I'll help if I can," he said finally, "but I don't know how much use I'll be." That evening, Lee sat alone in his specially made room, trying to process everything. Through the window, he could see the alien city stretching out below, enormous structures lit by soft blue lights. In the distance, mountains rose up, their peaks hidden in clouds. A gentle knock came at his door, gentle for a Magnan, which still made the walls vibrate. Commander Hannah entered, ducking under the doorway, even though it was 3 times taller than Lee. "Our scientists wish to begin tests tomorrow," she said. "They will need blood and tissue samples." Lee nodded carefully. Will it hurt? Hannah's expression softened slightly. They will be careful with you, tiny one. We know how fragile you must be. I'm not fragile, Lee protested, standing up straighter. Humans are tougher than we look. Hannah studied him with her large black eyes. Perhaps. But to us, you appear as delicate as a child. On Earth, I was considered tall, Lee said with a small smile. This earned him what seemed like a smile in return. Here, you are small, but size is not everything. Your ship's technology, though damaged, shows your people have great knowledge. After she left, Lee stood at the window again. The strange position he found himself in was becoming clear. He was the first human these giants had ever seen. They treated him with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and, most surprisingly, hope. They needed him. These enormous alien women, with their advanced technology and massive city, were desperate for help. Their species was dying, and somehow they believed the answer might lie within him. Lee touched the window, feeling the cool surface against his fingers. Earth seemed impossibly far away now. Would anyone there even know what happened to him? Was there any way to get back home? For now, those questions would have to wait. The Magnans had saved his life. The least he could do was try to help them save their species. Even if he was just a pilot, not a scientist, he would do what he could. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Lee looked out at the alien world one more time before turning in for the night. His life had changed forever, but maybe, just maybe, he could change the lives of these giants too. Lee stood on a raised platform in Neri's lab, carefully handling a small tool the Magnans had made just for him. After 2 weeks on this alien world, he was starting to adjust to being surrounded by giant women. The lab had been modified with steps and platforms so he could reach the equipment, though everything still felt oversized. Look at this display, Neri said, her deep voice gentle despite its volume. She pointed a long purple finger at a holographic image floating in the air between them. These are your genetic patterns compared to ours. Lee studied the swirling colors and shapes. The human DNA appeared as a complex web of connections, while the Magnan DNA showed simpler patterns with fewer variations. Your DNA contains elements we've never seen before, Neri continued. Her black eyes reflected the light of the display. There's something in your genetic makeup that allows for greater adaptability than ours. Lee had been learning quickly about Magnan biology. Despite being a pilot, not a scientist, he had always been a fast learner. He pointed to a section of the display where the Magnan genetic code appeared particularly uniform. What about this region here? It looks too similar across all your samples. There's almost no variation. Neri's eyes widened, her expression one of surprise. You noticed that? Our scientists have been studying that exact pattern for decades. Lee shrugged. On Earth, genetic diversity is crucial for population health. Without it, species become vulnerable to disease and environmental changes. It looks like your species has lost much of its genetic diversity in this region. Neri bent down closer to Lee's level, still towering over him. How could you see so quickly what we've spent years trying to understand? Sometimes it takes an outside perspective, Lee said. I'm not smarter than your scientists. I'm just different. I see patterns you might miss because they're too familiar. Word spread quickly about the humans' insights. Within days, more Magnan scientists joined their research team. Lee found himself the center of attention in the massive laboratory, his small size no longer seen as a limitation but as an asset. These giants, who could lift him with one hand, now looked to him for guidance. One of the younger scientists, Dury, created a special seat for Lee that could be raised to different heights, allowing him to work more comfortably alongside the Magnans. Is this better? She asked after he tested it. Much better, thank you, Lee replied, no longer straining his neck to look up at them. As they worked, Lee learned more about the Magnans' history. They had once been a diverse species with many different appearances and genetic lines. But 1,000 years ago, A terrible disease had nearly wiped them out. Only a small population survived, all from a similar genetic background. Their civilization had recovered and advanced, but their lack of genetic diversity was now catching up with them. It's like inbreeding, Lee explained to the team. When a population becomes too genetically similar, harmful traits become more common and fertility decreases. The Magnans listened carefully, some taking notes on tablets larger than Lee's entire body. "Can it be fixed?" asked one scientist. Lee nodded slowly. "Possibly. On Earth, endangered species with similar problems sometimes recover if new genetic material is introduced. We might be able to use parts of human DNA as a template to restore diversity to your genetic code." The lab became a hive of activity. Lee worked long hours alongside the Magnan scientists, developing a potential therapy that might restore genetic diversity without changing the essential nature of their species. One evening, as Lee was reviewing data alone, the lab door opened. A very old Magnan entered, her back bent with age, though she still stood far taller than Lee. Her skin had faded to a pale lavender, and her movements were slow and deliberate. "I am Elder Sue," she said, her voice raspy, "the oldest member of the High Council." Lee bowed respectfully. "It's an honor to meet you, Elder." Sue lowered herself carefully onto a bench, bringing her face closer to Lee's level. "I wanted to see this small alien who might save our people." "I'm just trying to help," Lee said modestly. "In my lifetime," Sue said quietly, "I have watched our numbers dwindle. When I was young, families had 5 or 6 children. Now, most have none. Those few born often die before reaching adulthood." Her ancient eyes filled with sadness. "Our greatest minds have failed to find a solution." Lee felt the weight of her words. "We're making progress, Elder Sue. There's hope. If you can help us, tiny human," she said, reaching out one enormous hand to gently touch Lee's shoulder, "you will have the eternal gratitude of our people. Not because you are stronger or more advanced, but because you are different." After she left, Lee stayed late into the night, reviewing their research with renewed determination. The Magnans had saved him when his ship crashed. Now he might be able to save them in return. The next morning, Lee presented a new approach to the team. "I think we've been looking at this wrong," he said, standing on his platform so everyone could see him. "We don't need to completely change your genetic code. We just need to restore the diversity that was lost." Using the holographic display, he showed how specific human gene sequences could be modified to be compatible with Magnan biology. "This wouldn't make you human," he explained. "It would just restore the natural variation your species once had, using our genes as a template." Nari studied the proposal carefully. "This might actually work," she said finally. "We would need to run simulations, of course, and then limited trials. But the principle is sound," another scientist agreed. "The human's approach is elegant in its simplicity." As the team excitedly discussed the new direction, Lee felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. On Earth, he had been just one human among billions. Here he was unique, the only one of his kind, valued not for physical strength, but for the different perspective he brought. Later that day, High Counselor Jia visited the lab to hear about their progress. When Lee explained the new approach, her expression grew hopeful. "How long until we can begin testing?" she asked. "A few weeks for the initial simulations," Lee replied. "If those go well, perhaps a month until we could try the therapy on volunteer cells." Jia nodded solemnly. "Our people will be watching with great hope, Captain Lee. What you are doing here may ensure the future of our entire species." As she left, Lee looked around at the enormous lab and the giant women who now looked to him for answers. The responsibility was immense, but so was the opportunity. Sometimes, he thought, being small had its advantages. Sometimes the outside perspective was exactly what was needed. The news of the humans' work spread quickly across the city. Lee's days fell into a routine. Mornings in the lab with Nari, afternoons reviewing results, evenings learning more about Magnan culture. Most of the giants treated him with growing respect, but not everyone was happy about his presence. In the great hall where the Magnans held public meetings, Sub-Commander Jin stood tall before a crowd. Her military uniform gleamed under the lights, and her voice carried easily through the vast space. "Why are we putting our future in the hands of this tiny creature?" Jin demanded, pointing to where Li sat on a specially built chair. "Our ancestors would be ashamed to see us begging for help from an alien half our size." Many in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Jin continued, her voice rising with emotion. "We should solve our own problems. Relying on this miniature alien will only weaken us further. What if his cure changes who we are? What if we become more like his kind, small and soft?" Li tried not to show how much the words stung. He focused on breathing evenly as Jia stood to respond. "Sub-Commander Jin speaks from pride, not wisdom," the High Counselor said calmly. "Captain Li offers knowledge our scientists lack. Would you refuse a lifeline because the hand offering it is small?" The debate raged on, but Li slipped out early. He had work to do. In the lab, he and Neri were making real progress. Their therapy showed promise in early tests, introducing controlled diversity into Magnan cells without disrupting their essential nature. "Don't let Jin's words trouble you," Neri told him that evening. "She has always feared change." Li nodded. "I understand her concern. It can't be easy to accept help from someone so different." 3 days later, Li arrived at the lab to find chaos. The door stood open. Equipment lay smashed on the floor, and test samples were scattered everywhere. Nari was already there, her massive frame trembling with anger as she surveyed the damage. "This was deliberate," she said when she saw Li. "Someone came in during the night and destroyed everything they could find." Li walked carefully through the wreckage. "The backup data. Corrupted," Neri replied grimly. "They knew exactly what to target." Word of the sabotage reached the High Council immediately. That afternoon, Jia summoned Li to her chambers, where she introduced a young Magnan in security armor. "This is Officer Min," Jia explained. "She will be your personal guard from now on." Min stood at attention, her face carefully blank, though Li thought he detected a hint of annoyance in her eyes. "Is this really necessary?" Li asked. "I don't want to be a burden." "It is not open for discussion," Jia said firmly. "Until we know who is behind this attack, your safety is our priority." As they left the council chambers, Li had to walk quickly to keep up with Min's long strides. The young officer said nothing until they were alone in a transport pod heading back to the science sector. "I should be protecting important officials, not babysitting," she muttered, looking straight ahead. Li glanced up at her towering figure. "I understand. You probably think this is beneath you." Min looked down, surprise crossing her features. "It's not that. I've trained my whole life to be a warrior. And now you're protecting someone who might save your entire species." Li finished for her. "Different kind of important, but still important." Min stared at him for a long moment before her expression softened slightly. "You are perceptive for such a small being." "Size doesn't determine worth," Li replied with a small smile. "That's something both our species could learn." Over the next few days, Li and Neri worked to rebuild their research. Min remained constantly at Li's side, vigilant and increasingly interested in their work. She asked questions about the therapy, trying to understand what they were creating. "So this won't change who we are?" she asked one evening as she escorted Li back to his quarters. "Not at all," Li explained. "Think of it like this. If your people were a song that had lost some of its notes, we're just trying to put those notes back. The melody stays the same, but it becomes fuller, healthier." Min nodded slowly. "That makes sense." One night, as Min was checking the security systems in the lab before they left, she discovered something unusual, a hidden device capturing all their communications. "Someone has been listening to everything," she said, her face grim as she crushed the device in her massive hand. They know exactly what progress we're making. Lee frowned. Jin's faction. Probably. Min agreed. But why go to such lengths? They could just ask for updates from the council. The answer came 2 days later. While searching through the science complex's communication system, Min discovered encrypted messages between Jin and several high-ranking officials. She downloaded them to a secure tablet and brought it to Lee. "I think you should see this," she said, her voice unusually quiet. Together, they decrypted the messages. What they found was deeply disturbing. Jin's faction wasn't just opposed to Lee's help, they had an alternative plan. They intended to seize control of the government and implement a radical solution to the genetic problem. They want to use a viral vector to rewrite parts of our genome. Min explained as they read through the technical details. It would increase reproduction rates, but at a cost. Lee studied the data with growing alarm. This would remove cognitive diversity. Everyone affected would think the same way, feel the same things. They'd be like drones, Min finished, horror in her voice. They would turn us into drones. This isn't preservation. It's extinction of everything that makes us who we are. Lee sat back, his mind racing. "We need to tell Jia immediately." "No," Min said, surprising him. "Jin has supporters on the council. If we reveal what we know without proof of their intentions, they'll just deny everything and accelerate their plans. Then what do we do?" Min's expression hardened with determination. "We complete your therapy first. Once we have a working solution, Jin's alternative won't look so appealing." Lee nodded slowly. "I'll need to accelerate the timeline. We were being careful, moving step by step. But now we don't have that luxury," Min agreed. That night, Lee barely slept. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. He needed to finish the therapy not just for the Magnan's survival, but to preserve their identity as a species. Jin's solution would create a society of near-identical minds, lacking the creativity and individuality that made the Magnans who they were. The next morning, Lee arrived at the lab before anyone else. When Nari joined him, he explained the situation. "We need to move faster," he concluded. "Can we begin synthesis of the full therapy today?" Nari looked concerned. "That's risky, Lee. We haven't completed all the safety testing." "I know," Lee admitted, "but we're out of time." After a moment's thought, Nari nodded. "I trust your judgment, small one. We'll begin immediately." As they worked through the day, Min stood guard at the door, watching for any sign of Jin's supporters. The tension in the lab was palpable as they raced against time, trying to complete in days what should have taken weeks. Lee knew the stakes couldn't be higher. It wasn't just about saving a species anymore. It was about saving what made them worth saving in the first place. Lee stood by the window of the laboratory, staring at the strange violet sky. The twin suns of Magna had begun to change color in recent days, shifting from their normal yellow-orange to a deeper red. According to Nari, this was the beginning of a rare stellar event. "It happens once every 100 years, she explained, joining him at the window. "The binary stars align and release a massive surge of radiation. Usually, it's just a beautiful light show because our protective shields block the harmful rays." Lee nodded, still watching the changing colors in the sky. "Your people have lived through this many times, then?" "Yes, but this time is different," Min said, entering the lab with a worried expression. Her usually perfect posture was tense, and she glanced over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "I've discovered something troubling." Min set a small device on the table. It projected a three-dimensional map of the city's defense systems. Jin's faction has taken control of the planetary shields. They're planning to lower them over the capital during the radiation surge. That would expose everyone to dangerous levels of radiation. Nari gasped. Why would they do such a thing? To seize power, Min explained grimly. They'll claim it was a technical failure, blame you and the High Council for being distracted by the humans' project. In the chaos that follows, They'll step in with their drone therapy, promising it will save those affected by radiation damage. Lee frowned, his mind racing. When will this radiation surge hit? Min's expression grew even more serious. 2 days. Maybe less. That's not enough time to finish our therapy, Neri said, looking at their incomplete work. We need at least a week more for testing before it's safe to use. Lee turned back to the window, studying the changing colors of the sky. An idea began to form in his mind, dangerous, but possibly brilliant. What if, he said slowly, instead of hiding from the radiation, we use it? Could controlled exposure to specific wavelengths actually accelerate genetic adaptation? Neri stared at him in shock. That's incredibly risky, but her scientific mind began working through the possibilities. Theoretically possible. Certain types of radiation could activate dormant genetic pathways or catalyze the integration of new genetic material. Could we modify our therapy to work with the radiation instead of against it? Lee asked. Perhaps, Neri said, already moving to her workstation. We would need to recalibrate everything, run new simulations. And we'd need a way to control which radiation reaches us, Lee added. Some kind of filtering shield. Min looked skeptical. Even if this is possible, we would need to be outside during the surge, exposed to the sky. My crashed ship, Lee said suddenly. The shield technology is still intact in some sections. We could modify it to filter specific wavelengths while blocking others. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic activity. Lee barely slept as he worked with Neri and a small team of loyal scientists to modify their therapy. Meanwhile, Min and several trusted security officers retrieved parts from Lee's crashed spacecraft. Will this really work? Min asked as she helped Lee assemble a portable shield generator. I don't know, Lee admitted, but it's our only chance. Word of their plan reached High Counselor Jia, who came to see them on the eve of the stellar event. Her face showed both concern and determination. What you propose is dangerous, she told Lee. But I believe in your vision. I will gather volunteers who are willing to receive the treatment during the radiation surge. By morning, the sky had turned a deep crimson. The city was on edge, with many Magnans noticing the planetary shields were operating strangely. Jin had appeared on public broadcasts, warning of possible technical difficulties, and subtly blaming the Council for being distracted by alien concerns. Lee, Neri, Min, and 12 brave volunteers gathered on the highest tower of the science complex. They brought the modified therapy and shield generators, setting up their equipment under the increasingly ominous sky. The shields over this sector will fail in approximately 20 minutes, Neri announced, checking her instruments. That's when the radiation will be at its peak. Lee looked at the volunteers, a mix of scientists and ordinary citizens who believed in their cause. I won't lie to you. This is risky. But if it works, we'll have a cure that can save your entire species. One elderly Magnan stepped forward. I have no children or grandchildren. Our species is dying. What is one life against our future? The others nodded in agreement. Lee felt humbled by their courage. As they made final preparations, the door to the roof burst open. Jin stood there with a group of armed supporters. Stop this madness immediately, she commanded. The human is using you as test subjects. He plans to change our very nature. Min stepped forward, her massive frame blocking Jin's path. We know what you're planning, Jin. Lowering the shields, creating mass panic, turning us into drones. I'm saving our species, Jin snarled. Better to lose some individuality than to become extinct. There's another way, Lee called out. A way to save your people without destroying what makes them unique. Jin's face contorted with rage. Seize them. Stop this experiment. Min drew her weapon. You'll have to go through me first. As Jin's supporters advanced, the sky above suddenly flashed brilliant red. A wave of energy washed over the city as the planetary shields began to fail, exactly as Jin had planned. It's starting, Neri shouted. Lee, the shields. Lee activated the modified shield generators. A shimmer of energy formed a dome over their group, filtering the incoming radiation. The air within the dome took on a purplish glow. Now, Lee called to Nari. She quickly administered the therapy to the first volunteer, an elderly scientist who stepped forward without hesitation. Min and several loyal guards fought to keep Jin's supporters at bay. The clash was violent but brief. The sight of the radiation surge distracted everyone. Down in the city, Magnans looked up in fear as the planetary shields failed. But instead of seeking shelter, many pointed to the tower, where Lee's group stood bathed in purple light. Word spread quickly. The human and his supporters were attempting something extraordinary. As the radiation passed through Lee's special shields, it interacted with the therapy exactly as he had hoped. The volunteers' bodies began to glow from within, their genetic material responding to the combined treatment. Jin pushed past Min and rushed toward Lee. "Stop this. You have no idea what you're doing to them." "Look at them," Lee said calmly, pointing to the volunteers. "They're not in pain. They're being healed." The volunteers stood tall, their bodies absorbing the filtered radiation. The eldest among them, who had been stooped with age, gradually straightened her back. Her faded skin regained some of its youthful purple luster. "It's working," Nari whispered, checking her instruments. "The genetic damage is actually reversing." Jin stopped in her tracks, staring in disbelief. The sight was so remarkable that even her supporters lowered their weapons. Down below, citizens had gathered in the streets, watching the spectacle. Despite the failing shields, they seemed more interested in what was happening on the tower than in seeking shelter. When they saw the volunteers glowing with health, rather than suffering from radiation exposure, a cheer went up. Jin's claims that the human was trying to harm them fell apart in that moment. The courage of those volunteering for the treatment, standing proud under the red sky, spoke louder than any words. As the radiation surge reached its peak, Lee adjusted the shields to capture the most beneficial wavelengths. The volunteers' bodies continued to glow, their DNA being rewritten not into something new, but into what it should have been all along. Min moved to stand beside Lee, her weapon lowered but still ready. "It seems even Jin cannot argue with success," she said quietly. Lee nodded, watching as the red sky began to fade to its normal violet. "Sometimes the truth is visible for all to see. We just need to be brave enough to stand in its light." 3 months passed since the dramatic day on the tower. Lee sat in a special chair in the Magnan Medical Center, reviewing data on a screen. The results were better than anyone had dared hope. Every Magnan who received the therapy showed complete reversal of genetic damage. Their DNA had regained the healthy diversity it once had. "Look at these birth statistics," Nari said excitedly, pointing to a chart. Her giant finger traced the sharp upward line. 20 healthy births in just the past month, more than we've seen in the last 3 years combined. Lee smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "And no complications." "None," Nari confirmed. "The babies are strong and healthy. Their genetic profiles show the perfect balance. They maintain all our essential Magnan traits while having the diversity needed for long-term survival." Outside the window, the city looked different now. The once quiet streets were filled with more activity as hope returned to the population. Magnans walked with straighter backs and lighter steps, the shadow of extinction no longer hanging over them. Word of the therapy's success had spread to distant communities. Ships arrived daily bringing Magnans from all over the planet, seeking treatment. What had begun with 12 brave volunteers on a tower now reached thousands. Even Jin had changed. After the stellar event, she and her conspirators faced judgment from the High Council. Many expected severe punishment for their attempt to lower the planetary shields. Instead, High Counselor Jia had shown wisdom and mercy. Rather than imprison you, Jia had told Jin, "You will serve our people. You and your followers will travel to the outer communities, helping distribute the therapy to all Magnans." Jin had accepted this task with surprising humility. Her recent reports showed she was working diligently, perhaps trying to make amends for her misguided actions. Today was special. The Magnans had organized a ceremony to honor Lee's contribution to their society. As he walked toward the Great Hall, escorted by Min, Lee felt strangely nervous. "Why so tense, small one?" Min asked, noticing his expression. Over the months, what had started as a formal guard assignment had grown into a genuine friendship. "Today you are the hero." "I'm not used to so much attention," Lee admitted. "On Earth, I was just an ordinary pilot." Min smiled down at him. "Here, you are extraordinary, but not because you saved us, because you showed us that greatness comes in all sizes." The Great Hall was filled beyond capacity. Thousands of Magnans stood as Lee entered, their applause creating a thunder that shook the floor. Lee walked down the central aisle, feeling tiny among these giants, yet no longer intimidated by their size. High Counselor Jia waited on the central platform. She wore ceremonial robes and a serious expression that broke into a warm smile as Lee approached. "People of Magna," Jia's voice carried throughout the hall without need for amplification. "Today we honor one who came to us by accident, but stayed by choice. One who saw beyond our size to our need. One who taught us that the smallest hand can offer the greatest help." Lee stood straight as Jia placed a medallion around his neck. It was made from a piece of his crashed ship, reworked into a symbol of friendship between their worlds. "Captain Lee of Earth," Jia announced formally. "I name you Friend of Magna, Advisor to the High Council, and Savior of our future generations." The crowd erupted in cheers. Lee bowed deeply, moved by their acceptance. After the ceremony, Jia showed Lee something he hadn't expected: his ship, repaired and ready for flight. "We studied your vessel while repairing it," Jia explained. "The knowledge we gained has already improved our own technology. But more importantly, we wanted to give you a choice." Lee ran his hand along the familiar hull. "A choice. Yes, you may return to Earth if you wish, or," Jia continued, "you may stay here as our honored advisor. We have prepared permanent quarters for you in the central city, modified to your size requirements." Lee hadn't expected this. He had been so focused on helping the Magnans that he hadn't thought much about his own future. Earth seemed impossibly distant now, like a half-forgotten dream. That evening, Lee stood on the balcony of his quarters, looking out at the alien landscape that had become familiar. The twin suns were setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. In the distance, the mountains rose like silent guardians over the city. A gentle knock announced Min's arrival. She joined him on the balcony, crouching down to be closer to his level, as had become her habit. "Have you decided?" she asked quietly. "About staying or going?" Min nodded. "The council is eager to know, but they did not want to pressure you." Lee turned to look at the vast city spread below them. In just a few months, this alien world had become more home to him than Earth had ever been. Here he had purpose. Here, despite being physically small, he had made a difference that would echo for generations. "What will you do now, small one?" Min asked, using what had become an affectionate nickname between them. Lee looked out at the beautiful alien landscape that had become so familiar. Earth seems very far away now, and there's still so much to learn here. "Then stay," Min said simply. "Size differences aside, you belong here now." Lee nodded, feeling the rightness of the decision. "I'll stay." In the years that followed, Lee became a bridge between human and Magnan knowledge. His unique perspective led to breakthroughs in science, medicine, and technology. The Magnans built him a special laboratory where both species could work comfortably side by side. He taught the Magnans about human history, art, and philosophy. They incorporated human adaptability into their own worldview, creating a new cultural synthesis that valued both their traditional strengths and new ways of thinking. Lee also worked with Magnan engineers to build a powerful communication array. With it, he sent detailed messages to Earth, explaining his discovery of the Magnan civilization and preparing humanity for eventual contact with these giant but gentle neighbors. 4 years into his stay, the first child was born to a mother who had received the therapy during the stellar event. They named her Lena, in honor of the human who had made her life possible. More children followed, a new generation of Magnans who would grow up without the fear of extinction. 5 years after his crash landing, Lee's communication array detected an approaching ship from Earth. Humanity had followed his signal, sending their first interstellar diplomatic mission. The Earth ship landed in a designated area outside the city. Lee stood with the High Council as the human delegation emerged. Their faces showed shock as they took in the massive Magnans standing beside their long-lost astronaut. Captain Lee called the lead diplomat, her voice filled with disbelief. "We thought you were dead." Lee stepped forward, standing confidently between the two species. The Earth humans looked strange to him now, their normal height seeming oddly small after years among giants, yet towering compared to his own stature. "Welcome to Magna," he said simply. "I have much to show you." The Earth delegation stared in amazement, not just at the giant aliens, but at Lee himself. The man they had come to rescue seemed to need no rescuing. He stood among these enormous beings with complete confidence, clearly respected and at home. That evening, as both species shared their first formal meal together, Min leaned down to whisper to Lee. "You no longer look small to me," she said, "even standing beside your own kind." Lee smiled. "Because you learned what I learned. True greatness has nothing to do with physical size." Outside the diplomatic hall, the first stars appeared in the violet sky of Magna. 2 worlds had connected because one lost human had crashed on the right planet at the right time. Now both species had a larger future than either had imagined before. The end.